right, good morning. We're here today with Charles R. Ewen and Erik Farrell to talk about their article on the discovery of a gold signet ring in the fall of 1998 at an archaeological site on North Carolina's Outer Banks. Dr. Ewen and Mr. Farrell's article, All That Glitters, a Reassessment of a Lost Colony Artifact, was published in the October 2019 North Carolina Historical Review. Dr. Ewen is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at East Carolina University and director of the Phelps Archaeology Laboratory. His research interests focus on historical archaeology, specifically the contact and colonial periods. He has directed several projects at Tryon Palace Historic Sites and Gardens in New Bern, Fort Macon State Park, Hope Plantation, Somerset Place, Historic Bath, North Carolina, and more recently, a long-term archaeological study of Brunswick Town, North Carolina. Mr. Farrell has worked in material cultural analysis of various 18th century artifact assemblages in North Carolina and has conducted cultural resource management fieldwork in North Carolina and academic fieldwork at Moklos and Argelos in Greece. He received a master's degree in conservation of archaeological and museum objects from Durham University in England in 2014 and worked as a conservator with, Erik, you may have to help me with this, the Ohas
Museet Bewaring te Fyn.
Okay, in Denmark, as well as the Queen Anne's Revenge Conservation Laboratory. He is currently the archaeological conservator at the Mariners Museum and Park in Newport News, Virginia. So, gentlemen, welcome today. Before we get started, I'd like to give our listeners a little background on your article. In your article, you write the lost colony of Roanoke disappeared more than 400 years ago, and clues to its fate have remained sparse and open to debate. With so little solid data, scholars and the public alike could speculate widely, and in some cases wildly. A gold signet ring in the fall of 1998 at an archaeological site on North Carolina's Outer Banks appeared to finally provide some tangible evidence for the location of at least some of the colonists. Despite the preliminary and informal nature of the research on the find, as well as the hedging of the researchers themselves, the identification of the artifact and its tentative connection to the Roanoke colonists were never seriously questioned by other researchers or the general public. The only question the press entertained was what other lost colony artifacts will turn up next. Even for the archaeological community, the ring's identity was accepted, though the lost colony connection was never fully embraced. But was the credence given this artifact warranted? Though the discoverers admitted their research was preliminary, 2 decades passed before the ring was thoroughly analyzed and shown to be neither gold nor associated with the Kendall family. The implications for the interpretation of the artifact and the site in which it was found are significant. So, old research, old finds, more current research and in-depth. So a good discussion here. So kind of to start off here, kind of first question, can you give us, can you tell us about the Cape Creek archaeological site on Hatteras Island where the ring was discovered, and when was the site first investigated, and what sort of artifacts were found there? What was the context of what we're talking about here today? Charlie, maybe you.
I think I can probably start with this, and it's mostly my predecessor. Actually, the Cape Creek site, it's 31 DR1, which is the first site recorded for Dare County, was recorded by Bill Haig from LSU in the early 1950s. And so we've known about this for a while. And the interesting thing about the Outer Banks, there's only a few really stable places that doesn't have inlets opening and closing throughout its time. And so this is one of those stable places. And Haig noted it was one of the best sites on there, but he didn't really do any work on it. Phelps went out in 1983, I think, did a little preliminary work to confirm what Haig had written, and said, yeah, we need to get back here. But then nothing really happened for a little over a decade until a hurricane had gone through, and Phelps back out there to look at the site because the sound side had really been uncovered and was eroding into the sound. And it's a huge midden, and it spans several properties. And David, using volunteers out there and some students at ECU, started to do some work, and really got things going for a couple of years until he retired and left for Florida. And then it was how no one was there for a little bit, and then some other people from the Outer Banks got Mark Horton from Bristol University, and Mark came out for several seasons and dug on adjacent properties, but all still part of the same site. And I he hasn't been out for the last couple of years. Of course, nobody's been in the field because of COVID, but I'm not sure there's any new work slated to be on there. And the unfortunate thing about all this, it's a great site, but nothing's really been written about it. One of the comments that Erik and I had on our article that we did is like, why are you quoting all these newspaper articles? And it's because that's all there is. That and the actual field notes, which I have of David's. I don't have any of Mark's stuff, but I have some of what we have. And then Scott Dawson has recently published a book, and he talks about, he was working with Phelps, and then later, I don't know if he was out there with David, but he's certainly out there with Mark Horton, and he writes what he saw. But once again, we don't have any official archaeological reports. So it's a great site. It's got a couple of components, a prehistoric component and then a later historic component. And it certainly deserves more attention than it's gotten so far. The kind of artifacts that came from it, there's a lower midden, and that dates, radiocarbon dates between 870 and 1445 AD. It has a lot of pottery and faunal remains and things of that nature, typical of what you'd find in a late prehistoric site in eastern North Carolina. Then there's an upper midden, and that has some more Native American materials, but also some European materials that date from the 16th and the 17th century. But using the terminus post quem, you have to date it from the latest dating material. Charles Heath, who worked on the site with David Phelps, puts it at between 1670 and 1720. The 16th, late 16th century lost colony component. What's been found there? Well, we'll talk about the ring, of course, but there's been some copper artifacts, a couple of coins that date to the 17th century that had holes drilled in them so they can be suspended on clothing. There is a snap-haunce gun lock that probably does date to the late 16th century. A rapier hilt has been found. That's probably 16th century. And some counting tokens. A piece of slate with a letter inscribed on it, either an M or a W, depending on which way you're holding it. And some things like peach pits. There were some peach pits found there, and those probably had to come up from Florida. So there's a wealth of artifacts that have been found there. And so that's kind of where we are archaeologically right now.
So a pretty broad temporal range across the site as a whole for occupation, both prehistoric and into the contact and early colonial periods.
Except for that little
Except,
section that we want. Now, I'm not saying that one doesn't exist there, but there is no so far identified discrete 16th century level.
But stratigraphy and everything, as you're saying, from the lower midden to the upper midden seems pretty consistent with the being intact, and a good progression.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. When was the signet ring itself discovered at the site, and kind of why was I don't want to necessarily say the jump to, but why was it considered the smoking gun evidence that the Cape Creek site there was connected to the lost colonists, that missing gap that you were talking about?
Well, if I can jump in again, because I was actually at ECU by that time. I got it to ECU in '96, and David was working out. Phelps was working out on the Outer Banks, and every site has its signature artifact, its cool artifact that everybody wants to see. And the signet ring is certainly the Cape Creek site's keeper, if you put it that way. When it came up, everybody was very excited, and I've heard multiple accounts of who found it, and David apparently was dancing around with it. But we'll go with that. I'm sure he was. We were all excited to hear that, and it made it into the press right away, and they buffed it up, and this was in '98. Early in '98 when he was out there, and apparently he showed it to a jeweler on the Outer Banks, who just and this was just a casual type thing. He looked at it and said, "Well, I don't know. It's more than 10 carats. It looks like," but I mean, there was no studies. It was just, here, look at this, and this jeweler said, "Yeah, it's like more than 10." But and that got passed on to the press, and as I said, nothing really more than this kind of preliminary stuff was done. So it was seen to be a gold ring, and if it's a gold ring, then it has to be from someone important, clearly. And when you see the ring, it's got this lion en passant on it, and I learned what that means. That means it is got 3 legs on the ground with 1 paw up waving, and as opposed to a rampant lion, which is with both front legs up. And there was a local historian up at Roanoke Island who talked to someone who knew someone in the College of Arms, and they suggested, I don't know, it sounds kind of like it could be with the Kendall family, but all of this was preliminary. Everybody said, well, it's preliminary. We need to do more work on it. And there weren't any funds to go to England to get up with the College of Arms and do all that sort of thing at that time. I know Phelps intended to write it all up, but he became ill and then passed away before that happened. So we've got this preliminary stuff, and everybody just, but it was, not only was it in the local papers, but it went out on the wire. And so the LA Times picked it up. It was in the Guardian in England. My favorite part is was in the English version of Pravda. And apparently they didn't have access to the picture, so they used the ring from Lord of the Rings in their article, and which of course at ECU spawned a whole bunch of, okay, who are the characters on there? I'm still trying to figure out whether I'm Gandalf, Frodo, or Sauron in this whole drama. I guess it depends on your perspective. And so that's about all anyone really had, or if you were to email David directly and ask about it. And so everybody's kind of working on this preliminary secondhand information. And I, at that point, I didn't want to be part of this reality distortion sphere that drags you into all things lost colony. And so I was doing stuff on the mainland on my own. And so it was interesting, but I kind of stayed out of it for the time. So that, yeah, put the picture of the ring up so that the people could see it. We'll look at the one, we'll talk about the one on the right later, but there's the one on the left. And you can see when it's buffed up, it looks like gold. And there's the lion en passant. And, but when I first saw it, and this was in 98, 99, it had tarnished some. And I thought, I didn't think gold tarnished, but wasn't my project. And so I kind of stayed out of it at that point. But you see the date, it comes from a deposit that has 17th century material in it. And so if it's in the deposit with 17th century material, it had to go in. You can only date it as early as the latest material in there. So, but like I said, it was a cool artifact. Everybody loved it. David had it with him in Florida for a while to write things up, but after he died, all this material came back to ECU. It's in the ECU vault at in Joyner Library. It comes out on exhibit every now and then. Now, though, I'm not sure they're going to keep trotting it out as often as they did. But yeah, that's where we are on the ring. It was considered a smoking gun type of evidence because it was a gold ring. It appeared to be a signet ring, some noble person stuff. And there were several important people, although the Kendalls weren't really part of the lost colony. There was an Abraham Kendall from an earlier venture from the Lane colony, and there was a Master Kendall who was, I think, with Sir Francis Drake, but no one with the lost colony, but that didn't seem to bother anyone. And I will make the point that David Phelps never claimed that it was a lost colony thing, but he did, and I agree with him, think that there was a connection between the site on Hatteras and the folks, the colonists on Roanoke Island. The site on Hatteras, he believed to be the village of Croatoan, where Manio's people were. And Manio's people were one of the few friends that the colonists had. And so they certainly had contact there. Now, is that where they ended up? That's where you have some discussions.
So it was primarily the lion passant, the passive lion pose or imagery that with the heraldry that kind of tied it to the Kendall family. Was that the link that they were doing, or?
I'm unclear about that, because once I kind of got into it, I didn't see. I mean, first of all, nobody's coat of arms is a lion. It may be part of it, but it's not the whole thing. It's, in fact, the crest, it's on top of the shield with other things. And a lot of people had lions on there. I looked at, I pulled out the book of heraldry, and this is not my thing. It's not what I do, but just my preliminary looking through it, thinking, I don't know how they came up with that. Somebody that does that more than I do needs to look at it. But as I said, until later, I was kind of actually pulled into this whole thing a little bit later on.
What's interesting as we're talking about that, because I think it was 2017 when the writer Andrew Lawler approached you when he was doing research for his book on the Lost Colony, and asked you, how could the researchers be sure that the ring was connected to the Roanoke colonists? And you kind of you've covered that, and you've mentioned the fact that, well, the rings after a few years looked like the ring looked to be tarnishing a little bit in storage, and as most of us know, gold is one of the metals that doesn't really tarnish. 200, 300, 1,000 years later, it's still kind of going to look like gold when you find it. So, kind of along those lines, what steps did you take to determine the actual composition of the ring to maybe address that question and that concern that's come up?
Well, when Andrew contacted me, and he was an interesting guy to work with. He said, "How do you know this?" And I said, as I do often to my students, I go, "I don't know." I took him out to see it, and we both kind of noticed the tarnish. And he goes, "So how do you know this is gold?" And I said, quite frankly, I made a joke. I said, "Well, you know what I read in the papers," because that's all there was. And I said, I don't. And he said, "Huh, well, this is an important artifact, and maybe we should get to the bottom of it." And by that time, David had passed away, so I wasn't going to piss him off. Most of the other major players were out of the picture. And I said, "Well, I'm like Rick on Pawn Stars." I said, "Well, I can't tell you, but I got a buddy that can." And that buddy was Erik out at the QAR lab. And so he had just gotten a new piece of technology, and I'll kick it over to you, Erik.
Sure. So we had just gotten what's called an XRF analyzer at that point. XRF stands for X-ray fluorescence. It's an analytical technique to basically tell you what a material is made of without damaging. Works on metals and inorganic materials. So a question like this of what is this metal ring made of, it's ideal for that. Basically, you have an instrument, you're firing a high power X-ray out of it at the surface of the object. It's causing, it's interacting with the molecules, the atoms in that object, which excites them. They send an X-ray back at a different power level, and a detector in the instrument receives that, decides how much power is in that X-ray, and every element has a unique signature in that. So you can tell, okay, this has copper, zinc, gold, silver, whatever is in there, you can see what it is, and eventually you can take knowns and you can quantify that and tell exactly what an object like this is made of. And that's really what we did. Charlie brought the ring into us to take a reading on. My instinct looking at that, I was not gold particularly, but that's not, visually, that's not an instinct you should trust. Shiny brass and gold are visually very, very similar things. Once you put it in front of an instrument, it's a whole different ballgame. So we took a single reading of that and we got no gold. Even for something, if it was gilded, like a brass or bronze item that has had a thin layer of gold put over it, this instrumentation will show you gold. Because even if all of that has visually gone away, rubbed off, there's going to be enough of it left on the surface for the instrument to read. And we just did not get any of that. So, I mean, I distinctly recall sitting in the room there wondering how I was going to tell the difference between 10 karat versus gilt gold plate without having reference standards for it, because we had just gotten the instrument. And that problem immediately went away the instant the first spectra popped up, because boom, brass. And that kind of changed the whole ball game around that particular object.
And I guess to go back to Charlie's Lord of the Rings tie-in earlier, is like the quote of, all that glitters is not gold.
Well, that's when I became Sauron, I think.
I don't know, Sauron or maybe Saruman, the other wizard, sitting in the second tower. But the XRF sounds like a really almost an invaluable piece of non-destructive technology at this point for doing analysis of some of these artifacts and things. It's the
And it looks like a ray gun, which makes it even cooler.
yeah, like I say, it doesn't hurt that that it looks really cool. It's not just some camera on a tripod. It's a ray gun on a mount when you're doing these things. So very cool.
Well, once Erik determined that it wasn't gold, and in fact, he had all the proportions and stuff. It turns out to be something. There are different kinds of brass, and this is kind of akin to something called Rupert's brass, which is very bright. But Erik, doesn't have a lot of zinc in it or something.
Yeah, I think that was a high zinc content one.
And so it's shiny and probably what made everybody mistake it for gold. And quite frankly, probably that's what it was supposed to be, kind of like a gold knockoff type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so, okay, if it wasn't gold, and then Andrew said, so let's go on and talk about the whole, why do you think it's Kendall? And I said, again, I don't know Andrew, but Andrew was going over to England anyways, and he met with Christopher John Fletcher Payne. You know, it's a good English scholar because he has a hyphenated last name. Fletcher Payne, the portcullis pursuivant of arms in the ordinary at the College of Arms in London. And he looked at it and very quickly ruled out Kendall, and in fact went beyond that and ruled out anyone on the lost of the 1587 colony as being that, and said, you know, the lion was kind of a common crest on the top of many people's coats of arms. But more than that, then I got in and I said, well, if it's brass and it's not etched, it's cast. So if it's a cast sort of thing, are they doing one? And that's when, and actually I have to give credit to a couple of other people. Eric Dietz told me, you know, there are other brass rings that have been found up and down the East Coast, especially at this Wampanoag site in Rhode Island. And he put me onto that. And there were very similar rings found there with different items on it. And Blythe Straub, who was the conservator at Jamestown at that time, she said, you know, these kind of rings could be found at any good stationer's store in London. And so these would have made excellent trade goods being brought over and cast. And so you could get, you know, a bunch of them made from a single casting. And that's when some research was brought to my attention about a collector in England had found essentially an identical ring of it. And Matt, if you could put up that picture of the two rings side by side, there we go. That you can see the one on the right's a little greener, but it's only because it hasn't been buffed up. But that one also did, apparently, they said had some remnants of gilding on it. But once again, you can, you know, if it's a personal crest ring, this guy's losing them everywhere. And so it's not. It's an intaglio. It's cast into the whole thing. And I think I said in the article, using Occam's razor, you got several. You know, you couple of these same things. They're nice, but they're not something that there's something you would part with if you wanted to trade for something that you wanted from the native folks. They would be a good trade good. You'd probably get some good stuff for it, but it's something that the natives certainly would have been interested in, and one that you wouldn't have mind parting with. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a better explanation.
Yeah, so basically these were, for lack of a better term, became like kind of a mass-produced trade good type of thing with you know, the Native Americans that at the time didn't have the benefit of an XRF to know if this was shiny brass or gold. Or so they didn't really even care. It was good for adornment, or I mean, would this have been something that the average person would have wanted to get these to appear more well-to-do or more of genteel, or as part of the elite in traveling. For it's kind of like costume jewelry today. It's partly there for appearance.
I think so. I think part of that, or it might have been expressly brought over to trade with the natives, and the question then becomes, all right, so who's bringing this stuff over? And that's been the big question. Where is this European material on this site coming from? If it's not coming from the lost colony, and some of it may have been from the lost colony, all the stuff is small. It's portable. It can travel around through trade networks. If it's 17th century, as we think it is, it could be coming down from Jamestown. But I think a better route is the Gulf Stream goes right past the Outer Banks. And in fact, right around Hatteras is where you turn east to head back to Europe if you're coming from the New World. And before you do that, you want to get fresh food and water. And so you stop and maybe you trade with the natives for water or food or whatever. And I think maybe that's how some of this material gets there. But I'm not ruling out Jamestown. I'm not ruling out some of the earlier stuff from the lost colony. I feel like there's probably contact, but is it where the lost colonists ended up? I don't see the evidence for that yet. I'm not saying they didn't. I'm just not saying they did.
So yeah, so not it's more general, not any major implications for the association of this particular site being, with the Roanoke Islands lost colony itself. It's, there are lots of, seems like there are lots of possibilities out there to be considered. And I'll throw in from the maritime side and the underwater archaeology is, we have, they're in the neighborhood of, 5,000 shipwreck losses in North Carolina waters. And Charlie, you touched on it, where the Gulf Stream hits the Labrador Current right there at Hatteras is some of the roughest waters and most unpredictable from the beginning times. So trade, travel, and shipwrecks are all possibilities for some of these European goods showing up at sites. Well, Charlie and Erik, you noted that in order to objectively study the lost 17th century of this region, it's imperative to separate the data from the lost colony, kind of I think you call it the reality distortion field that goes on out there. And, a lot of people have been looking for it for a long time. And there's a lot of, kind of wishful thinking and hopes and dreams to finding it, like a lot of sites. Can you kind of elaborate on what you guys were talking about in the article with that, this distortion field?
I mean, everybody likes a mystery, fundamentally. Agatha Christie or whatever. The whole genre of fiction exists because it intrigues people, because it captures the imagination. You want to look into it more. And it's a great opportunity because it brings people in. It's an insight into history, but it also means that people like to jump on every little piece of evidence immediately, because it's one more clue in the mystery that they can try to put together to make the whole thing make sense in their minds. And the problem in archaeology with jumping on every little piece of evidence immediately like that is you don't give time for context to be brought in, or for outside analysis like this to happen. And a lot of the times when things like this ring get released to the media before there's a firm publication of it, before there's analysis, it kind of takes on a life of its own. And the Lost Colony does that. There are plenty of other things you can point to with piracy or the pyramids or all of those things where there's an unknown here that's really, really interesting, fascinating to look into. But it means that every little piece of new evidence kind of gets blown out of proportion, and well, the reality of it gets distorted.
Yeah, no, Eric's exactly right on that, and it is almost impossible to do work on the Outer Banks without somehow having. And how does this relate to the lost colony? Well, maybe it doesn't. We say in the end of our article is that the 17th century is really the lost century on the Outer Banks. We have an idea from some writings on the 16th century, but during the 1600s out there, nobody's writing about it. All the action's in Virginia and South Carolina, and North Carolina doesn't really, have much going on, or so it would seem. No, we think they do. It's just that nobody's writing about it. And so a site like the Cape Creek site can really give us some insight onto what's happening in North Carolina during this time. How are the natives adapting to these Europeans coming into their area? And so this is where all this interpretation comes up. Mark Horton and I think Scott Dawson to an extent feel that this is where the lost colonists went, and they slowly went native. And what we're seeing is they're gradually repurposing their items into more of a native use of it. I'm not on that page. I'm thinking more that no, these are natives, and they're getting European items and they're repurposing them to their uses. And we certainly need to work more at this site and need to publish more about that. That's certainly on us. And that's what's it's going to take is more work on that. But right now, as Eric was saying, it's a mystery, and that's what everybody likes. And when the general public sees it in the papers or on the History Channel or something like that, there's always that clickbait mystery that gets your attention, and that's fine. As long as we have your attention, you need to stay and listen to the rest of the story as to what's really going on. And right now, I think, and Tom Shields and I have a book at the press right now, and from looking at all the different ideas of what happened to them, looking at the background history and such, I don't think it was a mystery to the people in the 16th, maybe even the early 17th century. I think everybody knew those guys were dead, and there wasn't much to do with them. The fiction of their being alive was kind of kept going to keep the land claims strong for England, but I don't think anyone seriously thought that there was a viable colony left out there.
Okay. Yeah, it makes me to the points that the two of you takes me back to one of the premises from one of my intro archaeology classes decades and decades ago now at this point, that the context is key. You can't just look at the isolated find. You can't just look at a single artifact and rely on that. It's putting it in the context, putting it in the provenience and its association with the other things around it to tell the bigger picture, and not just focus on that one object and get lost in it, even though it might be really cool. All it is one cool artifact. It can't tell the whole story. You need the context and everything to tell the story and carry that through. You guys you gentlemen like to share anything else or any thoughts along these lines, or anyone that's online or listening have any questions that have occurred to you? Please feel free to post them up, and we'll have Charlie or Eric address them and kind of keep it rolling from there.
Well, while we're waiting, I'll just say that in doing the research for this Lost Colony book, the interesting thing that I've noted is that when you have very little data to work with, and we have very little data We've got John White's writings. We got some of Richard Grenville's and a little bit of Ralph Lane. When you have just a little bit, you can go with it in a bunch of different directions, and people have, and it all seems equally plausible. The archaeology, that's what's going to have to decide it, and they're really, even that's pretty ambivalent. Another deceased colleague, Ivor Noel Hume, towards the end, he quit believing that Fort Raleigh had anything to do with the lost colony. He said that, yeah, they were on Roanoke Island, but that was a later 17th, maybe even an 18th century fortification that was put out there that overlays part of it. You know, and as far as to where the lost colonists ended up, we don't even know where they started out from. We have not found the main settlement on Roanoke Island. Is it eroded into the Sound? That's possible. Is it somewhere under Manteo in Shallowbag Bay and that it just got built over and nobody recognized it? That's also possible. There's not going to be a lot left to find, and you probably need to be an archaeologist to recognize it. So, but yeah, we're just going to have to, I feel that it's going to be found, something's going to be found accidentally, and that's what's going to be the key to what else we find.
Let's see, I think knowing how dynamic the Outer Banks are, I find it interesting that this particular site has been that stable for that long in the Outer Banks, from, you know, to progress from the, you know, woodland period of Native Americans right on up through colonial times.
Well, like I said, there's only a couple places: Ocracoke, Hatteras, Nag's Head, and in between there, they all have inlets that open and close, and so you only got a few places to really look out there to see things. So,
and well, I know it's sort of heresy, but that makes this site more interesting to me than it would be in a lot of ways as a lost colony site. You've got a 17th century site in eastern North Carolina, which is just inherently interesting, but you've also got something that is spanning European contact in an area of the state that's extremely coastal, and we don't have a lot of terrestrial sites on the Outer Banks spanning that full time period. Yeah, maybe none of the lost colonists were there, but it's still a really interesting site.
Let's say, so yeah, you both mentioned the desire or need to do more field work and more research there. Is anything planned or, you know, on the books, or any opportunities as we escape from some of the COVID restrictions here, moving forward, to possibly do some additional field work out there?
Well, like I said, Mark Horton has been working out there, but I'm not sure what his immediate plans are. One of his former graduate students recently got in touch with me, and maybe she's interested, Charlie Googe. Maybe. I don't know. I'm working at Brunswick Town, but it's an interesting place, and it needs to be looked at. And like I said, for a number of reasons. Honestly, now that David and his former students have kind of given up on what they dug up, I may actually work with one of my graduate students and write up what he's done, so that at least we'll have that part there. So that'll be something to do in my dotage, I guess, and then I can get people to have a talk about my misconceptions. In fact, I'm a little disappointed that I haven't outraged some people. Perhaps Erik and Maya's case is so compelling that no one dares dispute it.
I guess what's interesting too, that the illusion, if you will, lasted for 2 decades before it had a closer look taken at it.
Well, and like I said, it was Andrew that brought it up, and you know, the archaeologists were all kind of wary of the connection to the lost colony, but they weren't, I mean, they were buying the fact that it was a gold signet ring. And it was at that point that I thought, at least this little article needs to get out so that we can, put that to rest and focus research on the questions that it really brings up.
There is also just a technological change. XRF did exist in the late 90s, but portable XRF was a lot harder to come by and way more expensive at the time, and had not really made it into archaeology in a big way, certainly not to the degree it has now. And that is simply development of technology and the price coming down. At the time, if they had really wanted to test the gold content of the jewelry, you're talking wet chemical tests, you're talking acids, you're going to damage the object. And understandably, they didn't want to gamble on, okay, if this really is a 10-karat gold ring that is the definitive proof that the lost colonists came here, do we really want to dip this thing in acid? To which the answer was no. And yeah, I'd do the same thing faced with that question. And there's countless examples from countless archaeological sites all across the world that were excavated in the 19th century on through the 20th, and even today, where things exist that we can't test or couldn't test when they were found, and technology changes, things become more available. We will learn we were wrong about new and interesting things the further in time we get.
I say we've got our current hypotheses that we'll work with and carry through with until somebody proves us wrong.
Exactly
scientific, the whole scientific process. Put it out there and challenge somebody to prove us wrong. So, well, I think you gentlemen have covered this so well that we don't have any questions that have come up other than the ones that we've chatted about. So if any final thoughts, you could, if you want to share, or we can see about probably going ahead and wrapping up, and everybody can get a bite to eat. And Charlie, you can get back out to supervising your field school students this afternoon.
Haven't dug through anything.
Say make sure they haven't found the lost colony in Pitt County.
Well, that would be something.
Well, now you're going to start rumors.
Hey, there we go. All you have to do is mention it once, right?
All right. No, I pretty much summarized my stuff. If anyone has separate stuff they want to get to me offline, I'm at ECU. My email is readily available. Get on the ECU site and Google me up. I'm happy to. If you've got special insights that you want me to know, I'm happy to listen.
All right, Charlie, thank you. Eric, any parting words?
I mean, I think we've covered that. If there are questions on the analysis, my email is not particularly publicly available, but sorry, Charlie, throw it at Charlie and he'll throw it at me.
I'll get it to Eric.
Yeah, there we go. It's like the new and expanding technologies that let us do much better and more efficient research, especially non-destructive techniques. I think technology is helping us as it improves. So, all right, well, gentlemen, I think we can pass off to our gatekeeper here for administering with Matt, and go ahead and wrap up our discussion here today.
you.